The science thing, the diving science thing and medicine thing just grew naturally out of what I think is a really important component of diving, and that is that it's not just the diving itself. There's all this really interesting theory, what you used to call theory when you were in diving courses, which includes the technological sides of it and the physiology. And I was fascinated by that. And I think it's part of the whole diving package. And actually, I think this is one of the things the training organisations get a little bit wrong.
G'day, and welcome back to Real Risk, the adventure podcast. Now, for those who enjoy video podcasts, I've engaged with Podbooth here in Adelaide to produce the show. And I'm really excited about how it's going to work. For those who listen in the car or on your daily walk, the audio files, of course, will still be available. My name's Richard Harris, and you might remember me from my involvement in the 2018 Thai Cave Rescue. Well, that adventure has led to many other exciting opportunities, including the chance to chat with like-minded adventurers and risk-takers on this podcast. There's lots of exciting things to announce over the course of the season, and plenty of brilliant, daring, adventurous and thoughtful guests already lined up. There'll be more extreme athletes, more divers, more soldiers. More people who get off on going fast, climbing high or challenging themselves in ways most of us can't even dream of. And all of them will talk to us about why they think the benefits outweigh the dangers, why risk is integral to making us stronger, more resilient and better able to cope with the stresses of daily life. And let's face it, when has that ever been more important? Now today, I'm dedicating this episode to a fantastic charity, Operation Flinders. Op Flinders is run by a terrific bunch of volunteers in South Australia, helping kids who, for a variety of reasons, are doing it tough by getting them out into the outback for an 8-day adventure in a remote part of the northern Flinders Ranges. For many of the youth, it will be their first experience outside a city, and sometimes the first time they've been treated with kindness and respect. For some of them, it can be transformative and help turn their lives around, and I'm honoured to be a part of it. Now let's talk about today's guest. My good friend and a respected colleague, Professor Simon Mitchell, PhD, is a world leader in the field of diving and hyperbaric medicine. As the professor and head of the anaesthetic department in Auckland, New Zealand, Simon has an academic record that makes me wonder what I've been doing with my time. Suffice to say, he's one of the most widely published and well-recognised experts in the field of diving and underwater medicine. He's a skilled, entertaining and hugely popular educator. But the main reason he's on the show today is because he's also a very accomplished scuba diver with broad experience in the commercial, military and recreational arenas. He's an exceptional underwater photographer and technical diver. In 2002, he and his mate Trevor Jackson performed a world record deep dive to a ship thought to be the Australian Hospital Ship Centaur, which was torpedoed by the Japanese in 1943 with devastating loss of life. It's one of many wonderful stories, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the chat. Simon, good morning, and thanks for joining me.
Morning, Harry. Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
First of all, just to touch on the obvious problem at the moment of the COVID, the east coast of Australia now completely in lockdown, and I'm so sad to see that it's wafted across the Tasman and now it's affecting you guys. What's the mood in Auckland like?
Yes, it has. The mood, well, I think people are just resigned to having to try to knock it off again. As you're well aware, though, Harry, that, there's all sorts of opinions on this and what we should be doing and what we shouldn't be doing. I think, in general, it's fair to say that the New Zealand population is moderately compliant, perhaps compared to our Sydney cousins. And so far, this kind of level 4 lockdown has played out the way I suspect the government wanted it to. So people are sticking to it. I don't know how long that sort of enthusiasm will last, but I think people are quite keen to get back to what we had, which was pretty cool, like no COVID in the community and pretty much being able to do what you like, except travel overseas.
Well, the most important thing is that you and I can go diving in the Pierce Resurgence in about 6 months' time, so in New Zealand. So we have to get it sorted out for that important date.
Yes, I do have dive fears about that.
Yes.
Yeah, but anyway, fingers crossed.
We'll see how we go. Now, Simon, the breadth of your scientific career is enormous, and I've mentioned in the introduction, your CV puts most of us to shame. But there's a lot more to you than being what some people might imagine would be a bit of a nerdy professor. You're actually somewhat a man of action yourself, and you've had a very long and significant diving career as well. I don't know much about your childhood, so I'm fascinated just to hear a little bit about that and how that sort of set you up for this life of science and adventure.
Yeah, oh, well, it certainly did. I grew up in a little seaside suburb called Seatoun in Wellington, and there's a beautiful rocky coastline, and that's what the kids did. They just went diving, and I got sucked into that vortex and absolutely loved it. And from that point on, things around diving drove more or less every important decision I made about things like career. So I just followed the diving thread ever since. But that's how it all started. And my dad was very sick when I was young, so my brother and I kind of had to look after ourselves in terms of activities, and diving was perfect. It was something that you could do without too much supervision. My mum had the foresight to just let us go for it and not get in our road too much. So looking back on it, that must have been quite stressful for her, I imagine, but she did it. And we occupied ourselves with diving, and like I say, fell completely in love with it.
Do you remember your first experience of pulling on the mask and snorkel?
Yeah, I certainly do. Yeah, I can definitely remember it. We went round to this place called Breaker Bay. It was pretty cold. Had a jersey on my top and a jersey on my bottom with a belt in the middle to sort of hold them together. Lit a fire on the beach, got in the water for 5 minutes with a stick with a nail tied to the end of it to try and stick it into a fish, which obviously was an abject failure. And then got out of the water, warmed up by the fire, and then got back in the water again. So that's how it all started, and that's how things were done in those days.
Well, I can remember pinching broom handles from my parents and getting one of those green 3-pronged trident things you could buy from the hardware shop and sticking a nail through it onto the end of the broom handle and similarly trying to capture my dinner with similar amount of failure. I don't think I ever succeeded until I bought my first Hawaiian sling. How old were you when you first had a go at it, do you think?
It was probably about 10, yeah, when that started. We'd just moved to Seatoun from a different suburb in Wellington, and yeah, that's when it all kicked off.
Now, Kiwi divers are famous for being hunter-gatherers, and the idea that you might do anything else in the ocean is a strange concept to many New Zealanders still, I think. And, if you're not spearing a fish or gathering crayfish or abalone or power, as you call them, there's something a bit wrong with you. So when did you start to take an interest in the underwater world for its own sake?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you're exactly right. I mean, I was just sucked into that whole, the size of your catch bag is proportional to the size of your genitalia kind of thing that was prevalent among young male divers, and pursued that kind of thing for years. I was New Zealand junior spearfishing champion when I was 19, I think. But it was actually around about that time that I kind of started to break into other activities like underwater hockey. I was in the New Zealand underwater hockey team, and diving instruction. And that was partly to satisfy a desire to teach, which I enjoy. I think there was this perception that it was a place to meet girls, but, can't say that, of course. But I started to branch out in my early 20s, but there was still a strong sort of hunter-gatherer thread right through, in fact, I still do it. I'll still go and spearfish to catch a fish for dinner, but I'm not obsessed with how many fish I catch or anything like that anymore. And photography probably started when I went to Brisbane. So that was after my Navy diving, Navy career and the diving work that I did in the Navy. And then photography's kind of become the main thing over recent years, married with technical diving, which gets you to places to take really nice photos. So, but it did take a bit of breaking away from that whole hunter-gatherer thing.
Yeah. How old were you when you did your open water course?
14. Yeah, yep. I was 14, and I became an instructor at the earliest age possible, which I think in those days was, I think it was 19. Yeah, I think I was an instructor at 19 and open water diver at 14. And that was the old CMAS system. So you had to do a snorkel diving course first and then go on to do what they called basic scuba, I think.
Yeah, very good. So clearly it's been a part of your life for your entire life. So what about your study and the science interest? Where did that take you after school?
Yeah, well, when I left school, I went initially to marine biology because I'd done too much diving when I was at school, and there's no way I was a good enough student to get into medical school. They would have just laughed at me. And in fact, it took a few years of doing other things before I got to a point where I could obfuscate my terrible school record when it came to trying to get into medical school. The science thing, the diving science thing and medicine thing just grew naturally out of what I think is a really important component of diving, and that is that it's not just the diving itself. There's all this really interesting theory, what you used to call theory when you were in diving courses, which includes the technological sides of it and the physiology. And I was fascinated by that. And I think it's part of the whole diving package. And actually, I think this is one of the things the training organizations get a little bit wrong. They want to focus very much on the underwater experience, which of course is important. But I think part of what draws people to diving is that it is not just a physical challenge and a bit of an adventure, but there's an intellectual challenge there as well, and a whole body of knowledge that you've got to have. And I think people enjoy acquiring that knowledge. And, there's a little bit of the diving physician in every diver.
You've had a few careers within diving itself before you went to medical school. What sort of stuff did you get up to?
Yeah, well, when I first left school, I joined what was called then Fisheries Research Division. It'd be like CSIRO in Australia or one of those organisations as a sort of technical trainee. Those government apprenticeship schemes were quite common in those days. They're all gone now. And while I was doing that, I got seconded to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years for one of the most bizarre things I've ever done in my career, which was to travel with a group of guys blowing holes in coral reefs in various isolated places in the Pacific to improve access to the sea for fishing villages, especially on atolls where they can't grow much and they rely on the sea for food. And also they don't have any natural harbours, so a ship might come every 6 months, and if there's a big swell breaking on the reef, they can't unload anything and they'll disappear. They won't see another one for another 6 months. So this was a really important and well-received project. The truth is we were making very small gaps in the reef, but it was fun. It was like every day was Guy Fawkes. And for a young guy, it was an incredible adventure. I did a huge amount of growing up on that trip, but it was when I came back from that I went to medical school. So that's where my medical career started.
And what about the military experience?
That followed on from medical school. So I did one registration year out of medical school and then joined the Navy. That was at a time when Des Gorman had just come from Adelaide, and he had established a substantial momentum in diving medicine at the New Zealand Navy. And, this was this thread I was following. I want to do diving medicine. And so I essentially went straight into the Navy. And that was an incredible time as well. I saw and did things in the military that I would never see and do in any other circumstances. And I became the medical officer for the operational diving team. So that's like the clearance divers in in Aussie, and had some marvelous adventures with that group. But it was a marvelous time to get, true experience-based expertise with divers and decompression sickness. Really hard to do now because we're treating so much less decompression sickness. But back then it was awesome.
And that continued, of course, and you became, very prominent really in diving medicine internationally, and became the head of the unit, I think, at Wesley Hospital in Queensland, and then decided to go and retrain as an anaesthetist, which, personally as an anaesthetist myself, I feel is a really good fit for that specialty. Continues your understanding of physiology and gas laws and physics, that all the stuff that is relevant to diving medicine. But, you've obviously excelled in that specialty in and of itself as well, and find yourself now the head of the department and a professor in Auckland. So did you think you'd end up in such an academic space as that, Simon?
Well, the academic thing, it's great. Yeah, that's an awesome question. The academic thing started in the Navy because they wouldn't train me in any specialty I was interested in. I was interested in anaesthesia, but the only options for specialty training in the New Zealand Navy were general practice or occupational medicine, neither of which interested me much. And so, I moved on from there to the Wesley, as you pointed out. They needed a medical director and I had the requisite amount of experience. But what did happen in the Navy was they would pay me to do a PhD. So I did a PhD part-time while I was in the New Zealand Navy, and that's what kickstarted my academic career, got me passionate about doing research, and gave me some momentum. By the time you get to the end of a PhD program, you're publishing stuff and you know how to publish stuff, and by definition, you're kind of at the forefront of some narrow aspect of medicine. And so I carried that on, and it never stopped. Once I got a taste for it, I really enjoyed it.
Let's go back to the diving side of your life. Just for those listeners who aren't really aware, just define technical diving for me. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question too, Harry, because as you're well aware, the definitions of technical diving have kind of shifted over the years. It used to be that it was anything other than single cylinder air. I actually think it should be defined by the activity rather than the equipment, although, rebreathers, I think, are pretty technical no matter what way you look at it. But, decompression diving and using mixed gases, for going deeper longer than you can with open circuit scuba, single cylinder open circuit scuba probably defines it. But it's there's no agreed definition on technical diving. I think it embraces a whole lot of things.
When did you first embark on that journey, the technical diving journey?
When I left the Navy, if you count what we were doing in the Navy, that was more kind of professional diving, but it certainly was mixed gases, some rebreather stuff. But started in 1998 in Brisbane with Kevin Denley, and later on with Trevor Jackson with this, the project we developed around trying to dive the wreck of the Centaur.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because that was, a big dive, particularly relatively early in the development of technical diving in Australasia, or around the world, really. I think, the mid-90s is when it saw a really big boom in the concept of technical diving and the uptake of rebreathers and mixed gas diving in recreational divers. To do this quite big dive in 2002, I think it was. It was a big step. So talk to me about the Centaur and that mystery that you stumbled across.
The Centaur was a very famous wreck, quite a big deal in Australian maritime history. So it was a hospital ship, a converted cargo and passenger ship, but converted to a hospital ship, used in the Second World War. She was on her way from Sydney to Port Moresby in 1943 with essentially a medical battalion on board. And notably, I think it was the first time that they'd deployed female nurses. There were 12 female nurses on board who, were heading into a combat zone in Papua New Guinea. And she was torpedoed in the middle of the night, about 25 miles off the coast off Brisbane, and sank very, very quickly over the space of, 2 or 3 minutes, with the loss of about 264 Australian servicemen and women, most of them medical, which was one of the things that fascinated me about it. I thought that was a, very notable event. And really, it's only HMAS Sydney off Western Australia that was associated with more loss of life. And that was a combatant ship, whereas this was a hospital ship. I think it was around about 1995. Like many of these wrecks, Harry, and you know this, that, their position is roughly known, or the general area they're in is roughly known, but their position gets lost to history. And so in 95, a guy from Melbourne claimed to have found the Centaur using a ROV. And in fact, there was footage from his ROV on telly with this guy enthusiastically proclaiming how, well this video footage fitted the description of the Centaur. And so the position he found that wreck in, there's definitely a wreck there, became gazetted as the Centaur, and they built a church and a memorial on the nearest point of land, and every year they were taking, relatives. In fact, there were still a few survivors around at that time, taking them out there and throwing wreaths over the side. So it was a big deal, but it had never been dived. And what's more, we got that video footage that had been shown on Australian television that this guy had obtained with his ROV. And I, at that stage, had met up with this bloke called Trevor Jackson, who, as you know, is a pretty colourful, charismatic technical diver from Brisbane, who, interesting guy. He and I kind of hit it off, and we had these plans to dive the Centaur, but both of us brought different expertise and resources to the cause, and we formed this kind of natural team, and it worked very well. But as you point out, this was 178 meters deeper than any wreck dive had previously been. It's 2002. It's much more common these days to hear people diving to those kind of depths, but back then it was deep, and we were heading into the unknown. Trevor had a inspiration rebreather, an old classic, that had never been, no one had ever dived in Inspiration to that kind of depth. And I had a US Navy Mark 15.5, which you've also owned. They had been to those kind of depths, but there were lots of things about that project where we were stepping into the unknown. I mean, nobody really knew how to decompress from those kind of dives. It was all sort of seat of your pants and make it up and hope that you've given it enough conservatism, that kind of thing. But yeah, we did it. In fact, ironically, so here's a freaky thing, right? So we set aside an entire month to dive this wreck, because as you know, open ocean, you can't just choose the day you're going to go and just go out and do it. The weather has to be right, everything has to be right. So we set aside a month to sit around and wait for this, the right day to come along. And we didn't get the right day until the anniversary of the Centaur sinking. We sat there waiting for weather for 2 weeks. And I think it was the 14th of May, 2002. We actually that was the first day that was suitable. And that was the anniversary of the sinking. It was pretty freaky, actually. But yeah, we went out and did it. It wasn't without its moments. Trevor had a bit of a CO2 hit as we were leaving the bottom. It was a very fleeting visit. We'd planned that we were going to try and get to the stern of the ship where the rudder was. That was the bit on the plan of the ship we didn't think quite matched the video that we'd seen that Don Dennis took. And we didn't get to the stern. We only got midships. And the impression we formed was that it was just too small to be the Centaur. We've seen a lot of wrecks and we kind of know what it should look like. And this just seemed too small. After the dive, which we got through, Trevor had this CO2 hit. He was a bit discombobulated for a while during the ascent. I didn't really have a full appreciation of that, but I learned all this later. We resolved not to say anything because, we had no positive identification, either way. So, yeah, we weren't going to say anything about what we thought. But then 60 Minutes got to hear about the dive and they contacted us pretty determined to make a documentary about gravesite defiling diving bastards. And, we were going to be the sort of, prime exhibits. And so we were sort of forced to tell them that, well, look, we dived this wreck because we had a suspicion it might not be the right wreck and we're more certain now than we were before, but we don't have any proof. And they wanted to fund us to go back, give us better video equipment, all this kind of stuff. And we just said no, and certainly we can't accept funding from you because that would make the dive totally illegal. But they ended up making a documentary about it, which they did some poking around and found out that this guy from Melbourne who had originally found and videoed this wreck actually had convictions for fraud. And in fact, in a very colourful, only in Australia kind of thing, a judge had called him a big noting charlatan fraudster. So this was the guy that had found this, historic wreck. That threw them on the scent of it, almost certainly being, coupled with what we'd said being the wrong wreck. And ultimately, the Navy went up there and both measured using sonar and videoed the wreck again from a minesweeper and confirmed what we'd found. So, it's not the Centaur, which was very, somewhat unsatisfying because all of a sudden we'd disenfranchised all these people who thought they knew where their loved ones were. But look, the story's had a good ending. Several years later, the government funded the same ship that found the Bismarck and HMAS Sydney, I think, and they found it. They 5 miles further out from where we were, off the continental shelf, 2,000 metres. No one will ever dive it, but definitely it. They found the bell with Centaur written on it. Incredible. Right. And that's been cool, because if we hadn't done that dive, I think probably people would still be chucking wreaths on this thing that turned out to be an old tramp steamer called the Kyogle, which the Australian Air Force had towed out there in the early 50s to sink for bombing practice. And this was all available on a government website. Trevor tracked that down too. But the whole thing was quite a saga.
Yeah, so the information was always there for those who chose to look or could find the information in the right spot. Yeah, amazing. So, I mean, I need to go back to the words 178 metres because some people with diving experience listening to this that might not have quite registered with them, the profound depth of that dive, particularly for the time. In fact, even in today's diving parlance, that is a massive dive, particularly in the open ocean where if you're decompression, and I don't know how long you spent on the wreck, but let's say, you're decompressing for at least 5 hours, I imagine, and possibly longer. A lot can change with the ocean in 5 to 7 hours while you're making your way slowly back to the surface. So there are significant hazards involved. Do you want to speak a little bit more to, what can go wrong on dives like that?
There's a bunch of things. Obviously, there can be technical issues with your equipment. And when you're using equipment that, like as Trevor was, that hadn't really been tested at those kind of depths. And in fact, he did have some problems in that he got some CO2, almost certainly got some CO2 breakthrough, although hard to know for sure. But yeah, when you're sitting in the water, you worry about things like the weather changing, the surface support being compromised, currents that can cause problems, although we unclipped and had a drifting stage for our decompression so that we weren't hanging on in a current because, that area does get a lot of current. You worry about sharks. We used to have quite a few problems with sharks in the Brisbane area, not great whites, but certainly whaler sharks would come along and get a bit aggressive from time to time. One of the things that worries me the most about those big dives, getting sick in the water, and that can certainly happen. And I've seen that. I've been involved in a dive where my buddy got inner ear decompression sickness halfway through a decompression with 2 hours to go, and spent 2 hours, going off the rebreather loop onto open circuit to vomit and back onto the rebreather loop. Must have done that 50 times. Unbelievable bit of diving endurance. And, so those kind of things are definitely scary because of that, prompted you to go shooting to the surface because you couldn't complete the decompression. You'd be in huge trouble. Be more than just inner ear decompression sickness.
So let's put the other side of this. I mean, with those, clear and present dangers perhaps of those sorts of dives, what's the attraction of diving a shipwreck, for example, that perhaps no one else has visited before? What's the feeling of that when you arrive at a wreck?
Somewhat ironic to have Richard Harris asking me that question, he who visits the far end of caves that no one's ever been to, but you've encompassed it right there. There's not very many ways in the world these days where you can be the first person to have seen something. Diving is one of them, whether it's exploring a cave or whether it's visiting a wreck for the first time. And I've been privileged to be the first person to visit several wrecks of high historic value. And right there is another reason. Some of these wrecks mean something. And, the Centaur dive in particular was a classic example of that. I mean, either way, if we found that it was the Centaur, that would have validated its position and, and what was going on with all the relatives every year, etc. But what we did find was that it wasn't the Centaur. People thought they knew where their rallies were, but they didn't. But now they do. It's had a good outcome. And that kind of thing is, contributing to the elucidation of history, I think is a really huge attraction with some of these wreck dives.
That attitude of 60 Minutes that you mentioned, hoping to paint you as the villains in this defiling a war grave and so forth. I find that very interesting. I was caught up in a similar issue around a shipwreck on the west coast of the northern island of New Zealand that you'll be aware of. And again, a fairly deep wreck, 150 metres. And open ocean, not without some risk, and it was very anxiety-provoking dive for me. I feel less comfortable in the ocean, I have to say, than I do in the calm of a freshwater cave where things don't try and bite you or the waves don't try and drop the boat on your head and all those sorts of issues. So to put yourself out there and plan for a dive like that takes a fair bit of work, expense and time. And I think as divers, we truly appreciate the value of visiting these historic sites. And although they are often graveyards, I think divers are enormously respectful of that, if they're assuming they're there for the right reasons, of course. So I always feel pretty wounded when people accuse us of being, disturbers of grave sites and so forth, because, to share that moment on the wreck, might be the first or within the group of the first people to visit. It's a very spiritual kind of moment, I think, as you pour through the wreck and see those signs of an earlier civilization or an earlier time. It's a profound experience, and I think the value of divers, even recreational divers, not archaeologists in that space, is undervalued.
I must say that Trevor and I spoke about this at some length before we did the dive. I'm an ex-military person, Harry. I went to that wreck with enormous respect for the people that I anticipated might be there, because they were serving our countries in a time of war in the most difficult of circumstances. And, that we had made a very, very firm rule that there were no artifacts coming up from that wreck. We would try to capture images of anything that helped identify it, but we weren't, even if we found a bell, that was not going to be moved. And, that was completely out of respect for the people that were there. And I still get quite emotional talking about the Centaur because I just know what it all means to everybody. I mean, I've served on a warship where, our biggest worry is like when the next mailbag's going to arrive from overseas, with a letter from your girlfriend. And, these people not only didn't get any letters, they had other people trying to kill them. And in fact, in the case of the Centaur, that's exactly what happened. And so, there's no way in the world I visit any of these wrecks with anything other than the greatest of respect for the people that served on them. It's a war grave. There's just no way I would involve myself in taking anything. We've certainly recovered things from other ships, but not war graves.
Mm. So being involved with these sorts of more extreme dives obviously has also led you to being offering medical support sometimes on such dives. And I have to say you are a handy fellow to have around as a personal physician when I'm doing some of the diving we do. But it's also led you to an interest, I guess, in investigating incidents or even fatalities when they arise. And you were involved pretty early in a group called the Sydney Project, which was a wreck diving group who was starting to push the boundaries, and some early accidents occurred in some of the dives within that group. There's one in particular which is well published in diving medicine literature, where a diver coming up from a 110-meter reef dive, if I recall correctly, had some problems with carbon dioxide and came as close as you can to perishing. So just explain, and maybe we can talk about that case in particular. What kind of things have we seen in technical diving that we don't see in recreational divers so much when problems arise?
I was actually there. I was one of the divers on that dive, and in fact, was as close as you come to being a buddy of the person that had the accident. So, the lessons that came out of that event were as much learned by me as by anyone else. And it's probably fair to say that back in those days, and this was very early on, I think it was a year on from that Centaur dive, when technical diving was still sort of growing and we were learning a lot of lessons. It was driven by a strong sense of adventure and exploration that wasn't always as tempered by common sense and adhering to rules or protocols or procedures as much as it should have been. Certainly when you look back at some of the things that were going on in those days and through the lens that we've developed over the years, it's not optimal, that's for sure. But I think to answer your question, one of the biggest problems associated with things when they go wrong on a technical dive is that you've got a ceiling. You don't need to be down at 110 meters, which is where that dive was, for very long before your options for going directly to the surface safely close out completely. And that was certainly true of this case, where we'd descended, you're quite right, to a reef at 110 meters, and we'd been there. I think by the time this incident occurred, we'd probably been down there for about 10 minutes. The problem on that dive was that the diver had a problem with the CO2 scrubber. It had been installed incorrectly in the rebreather, and so he was getting a partial bypass, so rebreathing some CO2, and he became hypercapnic. Here's where the response problem started, although it probably didn't make much difference to the final outcome, because I think the end result would have been the same, but he kind of signaled that there was something wrong. We were kind of content for him, well, with one exception, David Appley, who another chap you know well, kind of content he just signaled that he was going to go to the surface. He was going to terminate the dive and go to the surface. And these days that would just trigger all of us to do it, or at least one other person to go back with him. But back then, there's this kind of attitude, oh, well, if someone wants to call a dive, they can call it, without too much effort to try and figure out how serious the problem was. And, that's something that just wouldn't occur now. So, well, certainly not in my practice, it wouldn't. This was a massive lesson. And he started back towards the anchor line. We weren't far from it, and started to ascend. And David Appley actually followed him and figured out that he really was quite disabled by something. Obviously, we didn't know what the problem was down there. And David tried to get him to bail out onto his open circuit bailout, but he wouldn't do that. And then he became unconscious at about, I think they'd ascended to about 80 meters by that stage. And David himself, couldn't make a direct descent to the surface, and so made this diver positively buoyant and sent him to the surface unconscious. And luckily, the surface support people were doing what they're supposed to do. Even though they weren't expecting anyone on the surface for several hours, they were keeping a watch out, saw him hit the surface, pulled him into the boat. And a whole lot of stars aligned, actually, that day. The rescue helicopter was actually in the middle of an exercise at the time that the call was made. This was off Sydney, and the guys on the boat called the emergency services and literally saw the helicopter start heading towards them the moment they'd made the phone call. So that, a lot of things went right. And the diver was airlifted to Prince Wales Hospital, where they were also running some simulations in the hyperbaric chamber with an intensive care team. So a lot of things worked. And he actually survived with almost no residual problems, having been extraordinarily sick with, fulminant decompression sickness. That's why we wrote it up, was because, it's probably the sickest diver that I've ever seen make a full recovery. But in part, that all was due to the speed with which he got evacuated. But look, a lot of lessons came out of that. And one of them was the importance of not having a laissez-faire attitude to what might look on the face of it like a small problem or a slight degree of uncomfortableness on the part of one diver. I mean, at 110 meters, there's no room for trivializing problems. You just have to. It actually leads me to speak about one thing that I think is really important, and that is, I've often referred to this as a sort of a strange corruption of motivations that occur when young guys, particularly, get into the water for a technical dive. It's like, it's almost as though the goals of completing the dive, adhering to the plan, achieving what you set out to achieve, almost override personal safety. And it's stuff that in the cold light of day, if you look at it later on, look back on it and say, is that a good idea? Or if you were told that someone else did that, what do you think of that? People would say, oh no, I would never do that. But actually, when they're in the water and they're the ones trying to achieve the mission's goal, they do that. It's like, for some reason, you are vulnerable to setting aside your common sense, what you know to be right, in order to pursue the goal of the dive. And we've seen this time and time again with divers. Once they get in the water, it's like they have this corrupted motivational paradigm where they just go for it no matter what, even though things are crumbling around them or they know they shouldn't be pursuing the dive, they do.
I think we've all been guilty of it to a lesser or greater extent at some point. And reflecting back on a dive, you could see a point where perhaps it would have been prudent to turn around and finish the dive at that point. And the other thing that makes me think of is the motivation for us all to be so fascinated by hearing someone describe an accident or analyze an accident to an audience where we can all sit there and think to ourselves, oh, that's the point where I would have stopped, or I definitely wouldn't have done that part. And that's a defense mechanism, I think, for people who engage in risk-taking activities, to say why that happened to them, but why that would not happen to me. And that's also very dangerous, I think, if you can't accept that, we are humans and we are fallible, and we should take on board that, that guy who did that was smart, competent, and perhaps more experienced than I am, and he made that mistake, and that's the point where it happened. And so why do I think I would have done something different? That's probably naive and reckless to not take that lesson on board. And I've certainly heard you talk about different accidents where you've pointed that out to the audience, that, just think to yourself, this could be you. And this guy was very confident when this happened.
The guy we're talking about is one of the smartest guys I know. He's incredibly intelligent, highly respected as a diver, technically competent, and yet made a few decisions on that dive. And I'm not just pushing this at him, like me too, like I'd definitely put my hand up in that regard. If he was contemplating those things done by someone else, you'd condemn them. I mean, I've seen this lots of times. Like there was another accident in Sydney where a very experienced diver was using cells that were in his rebreather, oxygen cells that were more than 2.5 years old, maybe 3 years, I think, was aware of that and continued and still did it, ended up in a cell failure scenario and died. Now, I absolutely know, with 100% certainty that diver, if he had been on the outside looking in and asked to comment on another diver doing the same thing, he would condemn it. He would say, "Oh no, that's terrible. I would never do that." And he did do it. And this is something that we see a lot in technical diving. And you touched on another point there, Harry, which I think is really important, and that is that when you judge an event with the outcome known, you always assume that you would have dealt with the situation better because you have knowledge of the outcome. And that's a real trap that everyone falls into when they're judging events in retrospect. And there's lots of literature about this. You have to be very careful about assuming what you would have done because you're judging the event when the outcome is known. And that is obviously not something that was known to the diver who was in the situation at the time. So when you're looking back in retrospect at these events, you have to be very careful the way, the assumptions you make. And I completely agree with you that we're all guilty of saying, "Oh no, I would never have done that." Whereas, in fact, lots of us would.
We do this even within medicine, don't we? We present cases, interesting cases to each other. And the fact that you're presenting a case means that something interesting, usually bad, has happened during the procedure or the anesthetic or whatever. And so the audience is primed to head off the problems in advance. So as soon as they see something deviating from what they would consider to be the norm, then that's the point where you intellectualize it and say, I wouldn't have done that. But yet, that sort of thing might happen in 100 other occasions or dives or anesthetics or whatever. But, the usual corrective strategy will bring you back on course. But in this particular case, because we're presenting it or talking about it, clearly that didn't happen. So, we become hyper vigilant in analysing those situations. I think we'll jump in and say that's the point. Where I would have sorted that out. That wouldn't happen. Well, it wouldn't happen to you or I, Simon, clearly. But,
no, of course not. Well, look, Harry, medicine is actually where most of the relevant literature on this kind of thing comes from. And, it's well recognised that when you're judging an event in retrospect, you always make assumptions about what the people involved in the event knew based on the fact that you know the outcome. And those assumptions are almost certainly wrong. It is actually very, very difficult to objectively and fairly appraise an adverse event in medicine or diving from the position of knowing what happened, having the whole story. It's very difficult to put yourself back into the situation that the people were in during the event itself. And it's the same in diving. But lots of these diving events do involve choices that are made where people, it is probably fair to assume that the people involved in making those choices knew that the choices weren't optimal, and yet they still forge ahead and do it. And this is where I get to this thing about corrupted motivations. And I just, it's a crazy thing, like, what's more important, surviving or getting to the end of the cave, or surviving or getting to the bow of the wreck where you wanted to go and see something in particular, and yet, I mean, the answer's obvious, right? It's survival, but it seems that when you're underwater and going for a particular outcome, it's easy to make bad decisions in that regard. And clearly people think they are going to survive. I mean, obviously, they just seem to fail to appreciate the risks of not surviving in the situation that they're in. Whereas if asked about it in the cold light of day, as though it was someone else, they'd all say, oh no, that's terrible. I would never make that choice. And yet they do.
The scene is set, though, in many ways, to make poor decisions under pressure, because to talk about your Centaur dive, for example, you take a month off from work and family, you park yourself on the coast, you're ready to go, you've got this boat on standby, you might be paying for it, you've got all these support divers and equipment in place, the cylinders are full, and, 1 week passes, 2 weeks pass, you suddenly get a good day, you jump in the water, you are conditioned at that point to push through any minor problems for sure. Whereas if it was a dive off the beach one morning before you had your Sunday morning coffee, if the weather looked a bit crap, you'd say, you know what, put the gear back in the car, let's just go and have a hot breakfast instead. You are primed to push through any minor irregularities at that point. And most technical dives have that circumstance around them. There's a lot has gone into getting you to the water's edge, and it takes a courageous person, in fact, to say, you know what, not for me today. And that can be even just a gut feeling for some people. And I so much admire, as I know you do, the people who have the courage to stand up at that point and say, let's call it off. And it makes me think of a chap I interviewed a couple of seasons ago, the base jumper, who had more jumps than any other person in the world and was still alive despite having almost forgotten the names of many of the people, that he has known who have died, because so many perish in that sport. And I said to him, well, why are you still alive after nearly 7,000 base jumps? And he said, because he just has he is very good at standing on the edge of the cliff and saying, no, not for me today, and walking away. That's the attitude we need to continue to foster.
We do. And I refer to it as mental discipline or cognitive discipline. And I'm just not, this is not my area of expertise, or at least developing cognitive discipline isn't, but that is what we have to try and instill, is the ability to think through the fog of, corrupted motivation and say exactly that, no, not for me.
There's a million things I'd like to talk to you about, Simon, and some of the stuff we've touched on has been a little bit technical with reference to CO2 and oxygen cells, and I apologise to anyone listening who's kind of not all over that stuff, but a lot of the philosophy and the messaging that's come through has been really valuable, and your stories about the Centaur and your early life have been fascinating. It's been fabulous to be your friend and colleague and diving buddy over some many years now. And as I say, I hope we'll be seeing each other in New Zealand in January or February to go and do some more cave diving over there. And you can teach me some of your special photography skills, which we haven't even touched on. Simon is an extraordinarily competent photographer, although I will say he's stolen most of his techniques from another one of his mates, Pete Mesley. But now I'm trying to steal them from those guys as well. So, Simon, I hope Auckland turns itself around and New Zealand turns around with the virus, and you guys stay safe over there. But thank you very much for joining me today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Harry. You too. Stay safe, and yes, look forward to catching up and diving again sometime soon when all this is settled down. Let's hope it does.
Cheers, mate.
Okay, cheers, Harry. See you.
Well, that's the show for today. Thanks for joining me. If you want any more information, you can check out the podcast website at realriskpodcast.com.